Mark Rogers TV and Last Word on Sports, talking Florida State. And when you talk about recent college football history, I don't know that there's a better rivalry in terms of sheer talent and magnitude on the national landscape than Florida State. And the Gators are back on the radar this season for the first time basically since 2012. We bring in David Waters from Gator Sports Radio to help us break down the Seminoles. David, of course, thanks so much for joining us. And you're a guy that's at the heart of this scene each and every year, whether it's in Tallahassee or in the swamp. And for me, the big separation in this rivalry over the last 25 years has been just sheer talent, speed, athleticism in this one that trumps a number of the other rivalries. Just your thoughts about why this one's a little bit different. Obviously, the recruiting war is huge down there in Florida, where you've got arguably the best talent in the country. So this one is big for this year, and it's also big for the next 4 years, if you look at it that way. But just what makes FSU week a little bit more special?
What makes it more special, just everywhere you go, you see a Florida fan or an FSU fan, especially this week. I mean, I was out yesterday, and even though Florida's had a good season this season, I go to the local grocery store, and I've probably seen more Gator fans dressed in Gator paraphernalia than I've seen all season. And part of that is because it's FSU week. And, this rivalry, really, really picked up its, big steam in 90 when you had Spurrier versus Bowden. And who can forget the quips, going back and forth with those guys. And like you said, and of course, these players know each other very well. They played against each other in high school, middle school for years and years. You have guys who were committed to one school, and then all of a sudden on signing day they go to the other school, and it's just it's a fight for recruits. It's a fight for state bragging rights, and it gets ugly at times. You remember in the 90s and early 2000s, so many pregame fights, and Ron Zook got his last win. Steve Spurrier never won in Tallahassee, but Ron Zook got carried off the field when Florida had beat. In Florida State and Tallahassee for the first time in a long time, and it was Ron Zook that got it done, him getting carried off the field. And, it's a big recruiting war, that day, so many recruits are sitting there in the stadium watching that game. And, the winner of that game gets a little momentum in those recruits' mind. And, it says Jimbo, started at FSU. He's only lost to Florida once, and that was in 2012, Florida's last, like you said, the last time Florida's been on the map. So Jimbo's had some really good success lately against the Gators.
Yeah, so a lot of people watching us can't relate to this, maybe not even yourself, but before about 1980, nobody cared about Florida State playing outside of the state of Florida, and I don't even know if a whole lot of people in the state cared at that point. And Florida State, under Bobby Bowden, once he had been there about 5 years, they broke onto the national map. Like 1979-80, they went to 2 Orange Bowls, and they took the big lead. Florida had some nice teams in the 80s, but nothing exceptional for the most part. They had a couple teams that broke out and made some noise, but really Florida State owned the 80s. And then when Spurrier got to Florida, that's when things totally changed, and it became Bowden, Spurrier. And almost every year, these teams weren't just in the top 10. They were in the top 5 in the nation. It wasn't an anomaly to see a number 2 versus number 4 matchup. They were always in the top 5 for about 10 to 15 years there. And talk about just NFL players just running all over the field. This was different than watching even some of the great traditional rivalries like Alabama, Auburn, Ohio State, Michigan, just in terms of the talent just being off the charts. And maybe some other rivalries have caught up from that aspect. But, man, for about 15 years, there was nothing like it when you were talking about just watching athleticism on the field. And obviously within the state, it means so much more than the rest of us just watching and being entertained by the football. So Florida State comes in as a 2.5-point favorite on the road in the swamp. And the Seminoles have 2 losses. The Gators have 1. And the Gators playing in the SEC, you would think that has a little bit more credibility than what Florida State's accomplished in the ACC. So that's kind of an odd number, but I think it speaks to some of the issues that the Gators have. But before we jump on that, it's surprising to me, David, that Sean Maguire's wrestled this quarterback job away from Everett Golson. I know Golson had 22 turnovers last year, I believe 14 picks, 8 lost fumbles. had a disastrous season, lost his Notre Dame starting job. But this kid, as a freshman, led a Notre Dame team to the national championship and then became more of a dynamic playmaker as they loosened the reins. He's a really strong passer, dual threat combination. And Sean Maguire, being a little bit limited, doesn't have a load of talent. He's a capable player, doesn't have the elusiveness of Golson. And considering that Golson's hung onto the football this year and hasn't turned it over, a little surprised that Sean Maguire's wrestled away the job. It appears, even though both are getting time, that Maguire's gotten the last maybe 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4 starts. And even the game that he didn't start, he played the majority of the important time in the second half.
Right, and I think the most important reason, and going back to what Golson's problem was, FSU was having problems like going and pushing the ball downfield, and they don't have the tall receivers they've had in the past. So it seemed like Golson just really had trouble pushing the ball downfield. And once Maguire came in, you saw more of those 20, 30, 40-yard passes going down the field. But you're right. I mean, Golson wasn't turning the ball over, but then, came to Georgia Tech game, and that was just, the surprising upset, and they couldn't really get the ball going there. But it all starts, with Dalvin Cook and what he can do to help these quarterbacks out. But, with Maguire, it's going to be interesting to see how he doesn't have a lot of experience, but he is an older guy at Florida State. So this Florida game is going to mean a lot to him. He's still on the bench behind Jameis Winston for years, and he's finally getting his opportunity to go to Gainesville and play against the Gators. But you would have to think if he does struggle a little bit, Jimbo probably won't hesitate to throw Golson in and see what he can do. If he could take care of the ball like you said in the past. But with that offensive line, you would think Golson, if Florida's defensive line pressure is getting to where we've seen it this year, you would think Golson may have the upper hand in getting away from some of that pressure if the Florida defensive line starts really abusing Maguire.
I think you bring up a great point, because I saw Florida State play Boston College, South Florida, Wake Forest, 3 teams that you wouldn't think that they would struggle with, even though Boston College does have probably legitimately one of the 10 or 15 best defenses in the country. But you looked at Golson statistics, you thought, okay, completion percent is very high, not turning the ball over. They've got Dalvin Cook running for 200 yards. Why are they not scoring? Why do they have 10 or 17 points on the board sometime in the third quarter, and they needed like Dalvin Cook to be Superman just to beat South Florida, and also Wake Forest. His last 2 runs went for 94 yards. Otherwise, they lose that game. They only won at Wake Forest by 5 points. And I'm looking at the numbers thinking, but you have to see them play, and they're just way too conservative, probably because they don't trust Golson slinging the ball down the field. And that's, the aspect of the attack that Maguire gives them. Going to be strange to see, though, whether they can take advantage of Maguire being a more accurate downfield passer than Golson against a Florida front 7. So you get the strength of the Florida team against the weakness of the Florida State team, and you're trying to protect not an immobile quarterback, but not an elusive quarterback in the pocket so he can do what he does best, and that's drive the football down the field. I don't know if that's going to play to Florida's strengths, though, against a Florida defense that's one of the best in the country.
Yeah, and you would have to think, Dalvin Cook is definitely going to be the main focus of this FSU offense. So you would have to think if Florida can control him a little bit, this probably is going to be a low-scoring affair. Florida would love for, their front 7 to control the game, but there's a lot of injuries that Florida's dealing with going into this game, and we'll dive into that later. But, but you're right. It's that front 7. If Florida can control, FSU's offensive line, who hasn't been too consistent this year, they will force Maguire or Golson, to make some throws. And the last time we saw that from Florida really in earnest was against LSU. They were going into Baton Rouge, and we figured if they could stop Fournette, they wouldn't have much of a problem winning. And it was only really the second quarter against LSU where the Florida defense fell apart, but they still controlled Fournette for the most part. And when they did, it was actually Harris, who actually did make some good plays against our Florida secondary for LSU to stretch their lead out. So it's going to be interesting to see if Golson or Maguire can do the same.
So before we continue the breakdown here, you allude to the injuries. So how do the Gators stand on the injury front right now?
Michael Wayne just had his press conference not too long ago, and this is a lengthy list with some big names on it for Florida, and starting number 1 with Alex McAllister. And I will say this first, though, before we start. Michael Wayne's kind of been coy with the injuries so far this year. When you really didn't think guys would play or they're doubtful, they end up playing the whole game and still playing. great football. So keep that in mind when I name these off. But defensive end Alex McAllister would be out. Jordan Sherritt, defensive lineman, out. Defensive tackle Taven Bryan, doubtful. Jonathan Bullard, the biggest playmaker on their defense, doubtful. Defensive tackle Joey Ivey, questionable. So there you go. That's 5 defensive linemen right there who are doubtful to questionable to out in Jim McElwain's mind. Then Brandon Powell, questionable. And then all offensive line has been struggling big time. So now Martez Ivey, David Sharp are questionable. Offensive lineman Kevin Dillard also questionable. And then defensive tackle Caleb Brantley and Antonio Morrison are now probable. So, there's a lot of big names there. Some of Florida's best defensive players are anywhere from probable to doubtful to out. So it's going to be interesting to see. I really do think it's McElwain really just playing the gamesmanship, coy. I don't – if you had to ask me, I say probably 2 or 3 of those guys don't play. There's no way these guys aren't playing. I mean, Bullard is listed as doubtful, but he did get hurt in the first quarter against FAU, but he came back out and played the entire rest of the game. So I find it hard that he's not going to play this game if he finished out the FAU game. But we'll see. I really do think it's McElwain kind of being coy right now a little bit.
So like you say, Dalvin Cook's going to be the center of the Florida State offense. It's going to be up to Florida to contain him. The comparison that we have is the one that you allude to, going to Death Valley, taking on Leonard Fournette. I think he went like 30 for 180, something like that in that game against Florida. But can you put that into context? Because those are the numbers. They look impressive, but you think the Gators did a decent job against Fournette?
I think they did a decent job. Florida didn't let him get the big, 40, 50-yard run that kills. It was more of a controlled yardage. If we remember, Florida still only really lost that game by 7, and there was a fake field goal involved in that. So Florida, even with Fournette's yards, were still in the game. They didn't let him get those multiple 40, 50-yard runs that are, just backbreakers. Florida to contain him, stayed in the game. And then, like I said, it was really only that one quarter, that second quarter against LSU that, was probably Florida's defense's worst quarter of the year. But they still came back. But their offense has changed a little bit since then.
So was the first Florida game with Treon Harris at quarterback, that was the Georgia game, right?
No, that was at LSU.
Oh, the LSU game. So that's the best game that he's played against a good defense. That's probably the best defense they've played. And that was his best performance, and they put up 28 points, minus the punt return, but still 28 points.
Right, and they still moved the ball, and that's why it's kind of odd to see what has happened to Harris since then. The LSU, Georgia, Vanderbilt, South Carolina, FAU, and in every start since the LSU game, he has progressively somehow gotten worse. Is it more tape, teams have on him? I think that's part of it. They've picked up on what McElwain and Nussmeier like to do tendency-wise. But Florida's definitely going to have to figure out something with FSU coming up. This FAU game this past week, it was a combination of Treon Harris and the offensive line struggling, but Harris has now a bad tendency to float passes. He's not making good reads. He tends to look deep for the big play first, and if that play is not there, he panics. He had another interception in the end zone when Florida was going to score. That's 2 weeks in a row that he's done that, had an interception in the end zone. And in the fourth quarter, he had a sack fumble that FAU returned for a touchdown. And I mentioned that fourth quarter. That's when you want your quarterback to be best. And in that fourth quarter, Treon was 0 for 5 with an interception, sacked twice, and one of them was for that touchdown for Florida Atlantic. The ball's not getting spread around like it was when Greer was back there and early in Treon's when he took over for Greer, and he's missing wide open receivers. Even when he does have time to throw, he's missing receivers a lot. So, the offensive line, like I said, it's helping in that struggle a little bit, but not much. And they're struggling with depth and energy. They're beat up a little bit right now, and there's not much depth in that Florida offensive line. And, as the season goes on, that's finally taking its toll.
And Florida State, despite the 2 losses, I think has a Florida State defense. Jalen Ramsey, Tevin Smith, they are very, Reggie Northrup, they are NFL loaded on defense. And if you look at their performance, most notably in a big game against Clemson, they held Deshaun Watson down and that Clemson defense until about 7 minutes left in the game. It was 13-all, and the Tigers not doing much of anything. Now, Deshaun Watson extended some plays on the last 2 drives of the game, was able to get them into field goal range, and then they scored kind of a back-breaking touchdown. But Florida State's offense kind of put them out there to dry on a lot of 3-and-outs in the fourth quarter. Otherwise, Florida State looked exceptional against probably one of the 10 best offenses in the country. So I'm going to make you offensive coordinator, David, thinking about the Florida State defense and what they bring to the table versus what you've seen out of the Gators on offense, and even the LSU performance against a good defense. I know we talked about it at the time. Treon Harris, his last few drives, not good, similar to what you said against FAU, not playing well in the fourth quarter despite having a strong game against LSU on the road. So how do you generate offense if you're the Gators?
I mean, since he is struggling throwing the ball, that's part of the problem, but there's going to have to be some, wide receiver screens. We've kind of seen them going by the wayside lately. And it's the easy pass, and it can also help the run game that's kind of struggling as well. Some wide receiver screens, some running back screens. It's Florida's had trouble stopping the opposing defensive line, and that's where the troubles come from. It's not necessarily teams blitzing and get confusing Treon. It's just the offensive line is getting beat right now. And so, running back screens, if those DBs get back or defensive linemen get back there, throw it over their head. And we've seen that called once or twice, but not a lot, throughout the season. And I think the biggest thing, and I think it will help Treon more than anything, is to get him on more design runs. And that's his game. And right now, I think the last couple of weeks, Florida's going in with a vanilla offensive plan, and to help Treon get used to McElwain's system. But I think McElwain's going to have to adjust a little bit, and maybe that's what they've been doing. And there's no sense in running Treon right now, to risk injury because there's not much behind him. But with FSU and probably Alabama coming up, maybe Ole Miss, but SEC championship game and FSU, the design runs. You can't hold anything back now. It's late in the season. There's no sense in holding anything back. If Treon is more comfortable running, let him run. If he gets banged up, so be it. But at least you gave it his best shot. You gave it your best shot. And I really think more zone read, more straight QB draws, and the probably second mid down distance, and third mid down distance. Get his legs. Let that be a threat. That can also help slow down some of that rush.
All right, David Waters from Gator Sports Radio helping us break down Florida State. I think this one might be 9-7. I'm exaggerating, but I think that these defenses could dominate. But obviously, when defenses dominate, they also may cause some turnovers that produce points as well. But I've got to let this one simmer for a few days before I figure out who's going to win this game. But David, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Mark.